Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar co-hosted by the Centre for Policy Studies and the Global Economic Neural Network, where we'll be talking about post-Brexit UK prosperity with a focus on trade and domestic regulatory policy. I'm Alice Denby, Deputy Editor of CapEx, and it feels like a very timely moment to be having this discussion on the day the Chancellor's announced the biggest contraction in our economy for 300 years. It really couldn't be a better time to be talking about how we get back to growth. Between Brexit, the pandemic, and the end of the Trump administration and the rise of China, global trade is changing. We'll be discussing what the future holds for Britain and what we can learn from the success of emerging powers like Singapore. And I'm delighted to be joined for this discussion by Shankar Singham, who's one of the world's leading experts in trade and competition policy, Martin Bell, the Deputy Director of Trade at the Scotch Whisky Association. He has extensive experience working with the World Trade Organization, and I hope he'll give us a bit of an industry perspective on trade. Frank Dunsmuir, who leads Fujitsu's relationship with the Customs and International Trade Division of HMRC. He identifies how technology can help solve both today's and future customs and trade business challenges. And Robert Colville, who's the Director of the Centre for Policy Studies, columnist at Sunday Times and my editor at CapEx. He was also co-author of the 2019 Conservative Party Manifesto and now sits on the Department for International Trade's Strategic Trade Advisory Group. And sorry, I should have said editor-in-chief at CapEx, not editor. But we're going to go first to Shankar to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Alice. And it's a great pleasure to be doing this again with CPS. We did a similar event when GENN launched its first report on how to recover from COVID and grow the global economy. So pleased to be doing this again. I think what I'll do in my sort of opening remarks is talk about three different things. I'm going to talk about the global trade, where we stand on global trade, what the UK's policy agenda should be in order to kickstart the global trade, the stasis in the global trading system to some extent, and improve its own economic growth prospects. And then I'm going to talk about the domestic policy choices and domestic settings that we're going to be choosing for ourselves with our soon-to-be newfound freedom as we leave the EU, or rather, as we leave the EU transition period, because of course we have already left the EU. And then I'll talk a little bit finally about our report on Singapore. So in terms of global trade context, we have a very difficult global trading. This is even pre-COVID. We have a very difficult global trading context. There has been a slowdown in the global trading system. The WTO has not made progress really on its its multilateral agenda. We've had some bits and pieces that have been somewhat successful, like, for example, the customs facilitation agreement at the WTO level. But in terms of actual liberalization, deep liberalization, the sorts of things that are akin to the Uruguay round, very little. We've seen very little. And we're now coming up to the 25th, 25 years since the conclusion of the global round, which is a longer period of time than we've really seen in international trade since the launch of the GATT, without a concluded multilateral round. So into this steps the UK with its newfound independent trade and regulatory policy, and I've outlined in previous speeches and documents what I think would be a smart global strategy for the UK, and I'm pleased to say that most of it, in terms of what we do unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally and multilaterally, the UK is advancing on. So in terms of bilateral, we obviously need to have a UK-EU FTA. We are in the midst of negotiating with the US, Australia, New Zealand. We are now having a live conversation and actually a process to accede to the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is really important, and it, in fact, has taken on, I think, even more urgency now that Biden has won the US election. We'll remember that the Obama-Biden administration, even though they didn't really negotiate the bulk of the what is now the CPTPP, certainly owned it, and it's certainly regarded as their trade deal in some ways. And it's not impossible that in the possibly in the last couple of years of the Biden administration, the US will reaccede. Trump famously pulled the US out of the TPP. But I suspect that the language coming from the Biden administration about working with allies and so on, and the choices that have been made by the incoming US president, very much the first team from the early Obama administration coming back in, that will certainly be a goal that they will have. So that's an important element for the UK. Where I think the UK is challenged is on this the unilateral pillar. What you do domestically, and I'm not sure that this is a point that is well recognised amongst, for example, members of Parliament and even within the government, that the domestic policy choices that you make in terms of any number of things, from agriculture to data to digital to any area, those choices and those domestic settings very much set your trade policy. If you choose to have relatively closed domestic settings, in other words, you choose more restrictions in terms of your domestic settings, and there's conversations obviously in agriculture and in other areas on this, digital sales tax and so on, then you're going to find that your trading partners will be less likely to negotiate deals with you. And I think that's where the Singapore lessons learned are quite important, because there are a number of things that Singapore did, recognizing the importance of these domestic settings for your overall global policy, and so there are certain things that we highlight in the report, like, for example, the choice of English common law. You see this also with the Dubai International Financial Centre, which is essentially adopted English common law and even English judges. So when you go into DIFC, you really walk into a complete UK environment. It's almost as if you're in the City of London. So these are core choices that the UK can make, and I think we can learn a lot from other countries in this respect. And I'd close by making just a comment about an old trade agreement from many years ago, specifically when Mexico acceded, or when Mexico suggested, and it was Carlos Salinas who suggested to then President George Bush, the first George Bush, in 1988, that Mexico wanted to do a deal with the US and Canada, and this became the NAFTA. The reason he wanted to do it was he wanted to lock in the regulatory reforms that he was putting into place in Mexico, because he recognized how difficult it would be to maintain them. And he wanted to use the trade agreement to lock in those reforms. And NAFTA was very much a powerful reform document for Mexico. So sometimes you can use your trade policy to lock in domestic reform that is very, very difficult to do otherwise. And certainly the countries that have succeeded, I think, around the world have done that, have run their external trade policy and their domestic policy reform very much along the same lines. And I'm pleased that Frank is here with me on the panel, because part of that is also how you handle your border and how you make the border work for you, in terms of not only your trade, but encouragement of internal trade, imports, and encouragement of investment. And of course, the UK's Freeport agenda is part of this overall domestic picture of creating a better regulatory framework at home, and using that to stimulate some new thinking about what constitutes better regulation, and use of regulatory sandboxes in the different free ports and so on is going to be a key part of delivering that regulatory reform in the UK. So I'll stop there. Happy to get into questions and conversation as we go through the panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Shankar. We'll go now to Martin.
Thanks very much, Alison. Good evening, everyone. I will be speaking in a personal capacity, particularly if I say anything interesting, but hopefully I've got a useful perspective from an industry point of view. I'd really like to try and flag 5 themes, which I'm happy to expand upon in discussion later on. Trade agreements, market access and implementation, disputes, regulatory convergence, and overall UK strategy and capacity. So on trade agreements, we certainly, as the Scotch Whisky Association and industry, are supportive of the UK's new trade negotiations, US, Australia, New Zealand, and accession to CPTPP. I think the value for us is not so much in what we would get traditionally, tariff elimination and recognition as a GI and so on. It's more the opportunity to do things a bit differently, and the value for us will be in implementation of those agreements. So in Australia, for example, what's most interesting to us is the Australian excise tax regime and some sort of inbuilt agenda that would see a conversation between both sides over time on tax reform in Australia would be the biggest gain we would get from that FTA. Equally, emerging markets are really where the traditional trade barriers for our industry occur. So if it were up to us, we would be negotiating with India to resolve the 150% basic customs duty on spirits. So although there is not an FTA as such in contemplation between India and UK, we think that there are opportunities to be creative and drawing on experience, for example, from the recent US-EU lobster deal, which I'm happy to talk about in a bit more detail later, to liberalise the basic customs duty on Scotch. I think CPTPP we are very supportive of, not only because it would deliver market access for us in a number of important emerging markets, but also because it is a 21st century agreement that is designed to grow and to deepen, and we feel that is the sort of agreement that the UK should indeed be exploring. But don't forget the WTO. You could argue that the WTO system is moving more towards what it was envisaged to be in the mid-90s, which was a space where coalitions of the willing could negotiate on new trade issues, and e-commerce is one example of an ongoing negotiation. And equally, moving into the second theme of market access, if we are looking at the US market for Scotch, the biggest issue we face there is 25% tariffs imposed on single malt Scotch under the Airbus litigation. So far, in about 13 months, that's cost us £400 million in lost exports, and that dwarfs the benefits that we would get from a US FTA. So market access issues, not very exciting, long-term technical work. For us, that's where the rubber hits the road. And that has to be a key aspect of UK trade policy. We've seen a lot of good stuff from the Department for International Trade at technical level, and things are really coming together, I think, but there's still a way to go. I think we're seeing good practice in a number of individual markets, but what we need to see a bit more is connecting what's happening in a market with HQ, with the international disciplines in the WTO and elsewhere to secure new market opportunities for UK exporters. Linked to market access is the third theme, disputes. We've been quite litigious in the WTO over the years. 10 disputes, and Shankar was mentioning a couple of them before we started with Japan and Korea. And I think it was interesting, Shankar's point there about trade being a driver for domestic reform. Often, all of our cases have involved tax discrimination, often very flagrant, and generally the governments have wanted to reform, but they have needed an international impetus, and a dispute has often been sometimes what these governments have wanted to help them face down their domestic constituents. So disputes are an important part of the toolkit, and I think clearly, there is an issue with the WTO dispute settlement understanding, the appellate body that needs to be addressed. But I think there's a more fundamental question of what does a UK dispute function look like, and how does industry engage with that? And equally, what do disputes under FTAs look like as well, which is an area that we have not really explored a great deal ourselves as an industry. Fourthly, on the regulatory side, there's a good example, I think, of the interrelationship between market access issues and trying to head things off at the pass with international regulation. So under CPTPP, there's a wine and spirits annex that deals with a number of common issues that come up in markets around the world in our sector. And that was developed because these issues kept on being raised in the WTO, and the aspiration was to have some sort of agreement at regional level that would avoid these issues coming up in the first place. And it's early days, but it has been very helpful in minimizing some of the issues that come up in that region. But I think we're now at the stage where that needs to be brought back into the WTO system. And if we can do that, if we can have that international understanding, then it will minimize the number of individual market access issues that come up. Very finally, given the time, I think what we need beyond some very helpful ministerial statements and speeches on the direction of UK trade policy is a long-term strategy. Opening up markets is a long-term game. It lasts longer than one parliamentary term, so we need to have an overall UK strategy. Ideally monitored by some sort of independent body. The Swedish Board of Trade is one example that would be well worth the UK looking at, perhaps some sort of OBR type body with a mandate to advise government, but also to review the success or otherwise of trade deals that have been concluded in the past, and to advise on priorities for the future. We need to build capacity and capability, not just in government, which is a work in progress, but I think going in the right direction, but also in industry itself. I think UK business needs to step up to the plate too. And then finally, and it really comes back to a point that Shankar made just now, that link between domestic policy and international trade rules. So I've given the Airbus example. There's also the agriculture and digital services tax examples as well. There are issues of compliance with international trade rules there, and when we are determining what our agriculture policy is, we need to bear in mind, yes, negotiations that we might be having, but also compatibility with existing international trade rules. So I will stop there, Alice.
Thank you very much, Martin. We'll go now to Frank.
Thank you, Alice. As Alice introduced me as the kind of technology background, my introduction will be around the role of technology within promoting our future trade. And what I'd like to talk to is some of the inspiration we have from leaders in this sector, such as we mentioned Singapore in the brief. What are the new trends looking like, and what are the implications of this for the UK in terms of how we should be thinking about our trade policy and the technology that will be needed to underpin that. It'd be no surprise for you to hear that I think technology will be fundamental to our success going forward. It's playing an ever-increasing role in the world of international trade, and that will only grow in terms of its influence and its ability to differentiate in the markets. We often look at things like Singapore, regions like Singapore, and they are consistently up there, top 3. I think they're number 2 at the moment in most easy to work with or to deal with, trade with. Not quite sure how the World Bank figures that out. And number 1 is New Zealand, would you believe? So interesting metrics there. And some of that inspiration is they are investing extremely heavily obviously in trade policies and trade agreements. But from a technology perspective, they've gone out of their way to look at ways of making trade with that region as simple as possible and as efficient as possible. Single trade window was one of their early concepts, and they started with that. And the idea of a single trade window is kind of what it says. You know, it allows organizations to trade through a single portal into the Singapore government. And so if you're a finance or an insurance institution working in the supply chain sector, or a shipping agency or a trader, you can access all of these different agencies and departments in one go, or in one portal, consistent view. They're a lot easier to trade with because of that. And there are some lovely metrics about how efficient they are, how much quicker it is to work with them, how much savings they've provided for organizations that work with them and trade with them. But it is a local focus, though, single trade window. It was a fantastic innovation, but it's a local focus on making your region easy to move stuff in and out. The new trend is towards the global supply chain. So now we're looking at the end-to-end supply chain. And this is where the step change or sea change in future trade negotiations, trade agreements will actually start to see some real merit, and where the power of technology will play a much, much stronger role. So in order to look across the supply chain from start to finish and facilitate a transaction from the factory to the buyer or whatever component you want, these transactions are going to go through many, many, many players. And today those transactions are fairly linear. You hand over information from one person to the next one, to the shipper, to the port, etc. And the information is as good as what was given to you by the last person in that chain. The future will see a fully integrated view of that supply chain, and that's only made possible because of technology. I would say that, but it's true. And those technologies are here now. So things like blockchain, and because there are so many data points and information points there, you will need artificial intelligence to make sense of that information as well. So the promise of blockchain solutions and components within the supply chain are that you can see the records you need to see, you're allowed to see, and you can trust the records that you're seeing because of the way blockchain works. I won't go into the technical details, but that's essentially what it's giving you. I can see where it came from, and I trust it. I know it's Scotch whiskey because of the provenance in the blockchain that it's afforded me. Yeah. And this is an important step change for the way trade can go. So if we think about the implications of that as we move forward, not only are we able to secure our intellectual property and our value in the goods that we trade with, famous Scotch whiskey, for example, we can also set up and manage standards with the trade agreements that we have globally. So if we start trading with developing countries in particular, when we're using technology like this, we can have much, much more certainty about the product that we are trading with, and we can manage the, if you like, the aspects in terms of health and safety, the green agenda, whatever fair trade element of that trade agreement, we will have insights into how that works, and we will have trusted data into that. So, for example, we are currently running some programs using blockchain on livestock. So the livestock is tagged. The ear tag is recorded to blockchain. The location that it was born is recorded, and DNA samples are taken. So we have lots and lots of data about this particular animal, all recorded on the blockchain. We can even track the animal in real time using GPS sensors and devices like that, all available here today. So the provenance of the information for that livestock is virtually guaranteed because of the way we're collecting it and the fact that we're putting it into blockchain. So we know it is an Aberdeen Angus, and we know where it came from, we know its parents, we know where it's been, we know its medical history, etc., etc. And when you start putting that into trade agreements as well, so those types of technology and solutions are now offered across that trade agreement, then we've got a trusted corridor of trade and a trusted relationship with those parties. So it has some fundamental benefits for us as we move forward. The other important side of this is as we start to think about this and the way this proliferates around the world and regions start to grow in this direction, there will be lots and lots of data, and data will become the most important factor that we'll all need to understand and manage. So if we don't get on this gravy train soon, if we are not part of that, and indeed if we're not leading it, then we will fall behind, no matter what trade agreements and deals we come up with. Yeah. We're not falling behind. We're doing okay. We're up in the top 10 still on those rankings, and we have some great work going on in our government at the moment, who are setting up initiatives. We do have a 2025 strategy coming out. We do have blockchain departments within BEIS and within Border Delivery Group, etc. And we do have AI groups forming within government, and they're starting to reach out to industry in a more consistent manner. And we need more of that. We need more of that stimulus. So it needs to come out of the shadow and into the foreground, so that we can all see that and make sure it's something that the UK can continue to lead. And we are one of the leaders. We need to continue that and grow on that. There are real challenges. I'll just finish off on some of the challenges there in terms of how this works. When you start talking about global, politics comes into it. So do organizations and regions want to share information like this? Do they, maybe competitive needs will drive them in this direction anyway, but we need cooperation. So as trade agreements form and larger trade agreements and groups form, within that cooperation, it will drive growth and it will pull in other regions perhaps. You need common policies so that we all understand how the data is going to manage and is going to be used. We need common agreement on standards, and we need common data management processes so that I know what you're doing with the data, and we're sharing the same sort of effect on that. So there's a lot of international work to be done to set these standards and to make this happen. But it is possible, and it is something that the UK needs to lead on as a trading nation, and it needs to be forming these consortia around the world. The states are very strong on it. The UK is strong on it at the moment, but we need to grow that force. So I think on that point, I'll be short and sweet and leave it there.
Thanks very much, Frank. And we'll go now to Rob.
Yeah, well, the other three speakers know a lot more about this stuff than they can live and breathe this, whereas I'm just a sort of enthusiastic amateur. So I'll just offer a few high-level thoughts very quickly, so we can get on to the next to the discussion. I mean, I think, you know, if you look, as Martin kind of alluded to, if you look at where we were back in 2016 or even back in 2018, there was a sort of widespread feeling that Britain was a bit of an amateur at trade. We'd never negotiated our own trade deals. We'd outsourced that to the EU. There was, frankly, a lot of skepticism that we would be able to build the capacity, the quality of people. The idea was we would be eaten for lunch by the big boys once we go into this playing field, and that doesn't seem to have happened. There is still a work to go, but we have built a pretty good quality and pretty sizable trade negotiating team. The deal with Japan just recently, I haven't seen anyone kind of say things on that which were sort of scathing or skeptical in the way that you might expect. We just had the rolling over of CETA, obviously. But the elephant in the room is that no matter what happens in the EU negotiations, which are happening, you know, which we're going to find out about in the next week or so, there will be significant trade frictions with our largest trading partner, and we need to make that good. And there's a kind of parallel here with Brexit as a whole. Like, we can't just do the sort of bad photocopy model. We can't just kind of go and try and get a slightly worse or a significantly worse version of the deals and arrangements we had before. We need to do things differently and better, and sort of lean into our advantages and be more agile and flexible. And you know, the other speakers have touched on this completely. The Japan deal is actually a really good example of that. There's a lot in there on services and data, which is stuff that our economy is very good at, and you know, we really need to see that in expanded upon. Shanker's absolutely right. This isn't just about what happened. This isn't just about trade and trade deals. It's about what happens in the UK. You know, the best thing about trade is that it lowers costs for consumers. It provokes British firms to be more competitive. The most productive UK firms are those exposed to foreign markets or indeed with foreign ownership. And hopefully it can be used to spur more companies to get involved in exports. things like free ports, already mentioned, a great idea proposed by Rishi Sunak in a CPS paper back in 2016. And that's not just about their sort of role in trade. It's about using them as the hub of opportunity zones, enterprise zones in some of the most deprived parts of the country, and using creative regulatory and administrative methods to ensure that they are attractive to employers. It's likewise, it's not just about trade deals more broadly. Martin pointed out the ridiculous fines on Scotch whisky. There's Frank talked about the technology that powers trade, which is hugely important. If you talk to the City of London, for example, they'd say that actually their focus, they think the focus for financial services is less on trade deals, big kind of blockbuster productions, and more on sort of a relentless process of getting mutual recognition agreements, making sure standards are equivalent in countries. Basically, there's a lot of trade which is just about whether you can actually deal with people, as opposed to whether there is a big kind of 600-page treaty enshrining the laws. And the final thing I'd say is something you don't really hear very often in this debate, which is that we do need to pick losers as well as winners. So there's often a sense of, the kind of out and into the world feeling that now we should just go off in every single direction and sign trade deals with absolutely everyone, and British firms should be encouraged to sort of pitch up in Mongolia and Paraguay and increase their exports. And by all means they should do that, but the truth is, there's a lot of kind of hard edge stuff that happens with trade as well. There's issues, it's not just about, it's about which countries you choose to sign trade deals with, but also, how many flights do you have to that country? How many visas, how easy is it for their business people to get visas here? How easy is it for your business people to get visas there? There are countries and areas of the world where we don't have historic legal advantages in the way. So if you're a business in South America and you're looking to someone outside of your borders for capital, for example, you're always going to go to Spain. You're always going to go to New York, because those if you're in Brazil, you might go to Lisbon. Those are kind of where the historical ties are. So I think we need to be sort of quite clever about where we about picking and choosing winners in terms of the countries we really invest in, not just in trying to negotiate trade deals with, but trying to ensure that the whole process of trade and doing business together is as smooth as possible. And that's it from me.
Great, thanks very much, Rob, and thanks to all our panelists. That was really interesting. I think you've each identified some real opportunities for the future of trade in Britain, but some barriers as well. So perhaps we'll start with a reasonably general question on this day of fairly gloomy economic news. How optimistic do you feel about the future of trade?
Maybe I'll have a quick go at that. So I think it's quite useful to look at what the UK's done so far on trade policy in these different boxes or these different buckets. What are we doing unilaterally? Let's look at the bilateral deals. Let's look at CPTPP accession. How far have we made? How much progress are we making in all of these different things? And how much progress are we making in the WTO? And I think actually I would give a pretty good grade to DIT on all of those different areas. But I'll come back to my point that I made about domestic policy choices. The area where I think there is most uncertainty is what exactly are our domestic policy choices going to be? And essentially the question is, who do we want to be as a country? And those choices will affect that external trade policy. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the opportunity is there for the UK. And I think it is being welcomed by trading partners who see it. It's not very often that a major G7 country suddenly emerges on the global independent trade policy stage, de novo, or reasonably de novo. So I think other trading partners who are like-minded, the sort of CPTPP countries, the US, others, see this as a very big change. And I would say, I know we often talk about it's a tripolar world. You've got China, the US, and Europe. I don't actually agree with that assessment. I don't think it is a tripolar world. I think it's a bipolar world, where you essentially have some countries and some sectors that are very much about competitive markets capitalism, if you will, competition on the merits, competition as the organizing sort of economic principle. And then you've got the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, which is what you might call state-led capitalism or government distortions. And you see a lot of the government distortions or state-led capitalism are carried by these internal market distortions, these domestic choices. And I think a lot of countries in the world that are closer to the competitive market end of the spectrum are hoping to see the G5 economy move in their direction. And, you know, frankly, there are some on the other side of the spectrum who would like to see the G5 economy move in the other direction. So where we go will determine our future.
Martin, do you have anything to say about how optimistic you're feeling about the future?
Well, things can only get better, as someone once said. I think for us the really big issue is US tariffs, and I think just where that process is at the moment, I think we're perhaps seeing the signs that it might come to an end at some point relatively soon. So I think from our own selfish perspective, that's hopeful. And once we're through the transition to the new normal in terms of our relation with the EU, I think that gives us a basis. We know where we are in terms of developing UK trade policy, and that will give us some clarity. But you know, I come from a can-do industry, and we do export to Paraguay and Mongolia. So you know, we tend to be pretty positive generally, and as I say, I think once we get over the current issues that we are facing, which are very serious for us, then yeah, pretty positive.
Well, there's always going to be demand for Scotch whisky. So.
Indeed.
Frank, I mean, obviously technology presents huge opportunities, but are there problems as well? I mean, as we've seen with Huawei, does technology produce problems in terms of, you know, trusting each other?
Yeah. So and this is one of the big challenges as the in this concept of reaching out across the global supply chain means ever more cooperation, and some of those supply chains are into regions where we have this polarization. So you know, we have a kind of an open system within Europe. We have protectionism around GDPR, etc., data and rights, etc. So you can think of us more of an open type environment, etc. And you look at the closed environment around some of the Far East and China, where they've got restrictions around technologies and access, etc. So there will definitely be challenges there. And I guess as some of these trade situations polarize, or you know, leading to disagreements, etc., then that will only harm the ability to implement these policies or these global structures. But I think what will drive it, my optimistic view on it, what will drive it is our forums and groups, trade agreements, you know, the TTIPs of this world, and what we've seen with India and Japan, etc., recently in Australia. You know, as those groups get together more and more and start to form those relationships across different trading regions, as they are successful, they'll start to pull in trade from even some of the more challenging areas. So you can still do this within those kind of umbrellas, those far-reaching trade agreements. You know, those all-encompassing trade agreements. You can implement it in groups.
And Rob, you're well connected in the government. How optimistic are you feeling about a Brexit deal and other trade deals?
I mean, I'm pretty optimistic. I think. I mean, well, Brexit deal. We'll see what happens. My money has been on a deal all year. And I think that's probably still the most likely outcome. Other stuff, you know, obviously Donald Trump's departure, assuming he accepts that he's got to depart, does open. I mean, the Democrats are, you know, I think hawkishness on China is the new normal. in not just in America, by the way, but equally there is a there's not the sort of enthusiasm for a trade deal to validate Brexit, but they understand the economic logic of trade deals make us all richer. In the UK, the forces of reaction came close to the kind of to banning us from ever doing any trade deals because of chlorinated chicken, but didn't quite get there. This idea that basically this basically kind of like a mirror image of the EU. We weren't just sort of saying we have already banned chlorinated chicken. We were demanding the rights to impose our own agricultural production methods on other countries, which would kill any prospect of doing trade deals. And that's the government have been commendably firm in fighting that, even if they've had to give ground in some areas. So I'm optimistic. Ultimately, I think enough people around the world, or enough groups, as Frank was saying, see the benefits of free trade. I think TPP, now that we can all pronounce it properly, is pretty exciting, and I think it's really interesting. It's gone from being kind of, why are we talking about this? That's really far away, isn't it? Kind of thing. When the idea was first put forward, to actually, most people seem to understand it, the logic, and seem pretty enthused about it.
Great, thanks. Shankar, I'm interested in what you were saying about a bipolar world. Doesn't Singapore sit somewhere between the two poles? We have a question here from Gina Miller, and sorry, Gina, I'm paraphrasing you a bit here, but she says that Singapore's economic success is inextricably linked to its strong and ever-present bureaucratic government that has a controlling stake in most of the country's large companies. She also points out that people in Singapore have enormous confidence in their government, whereas in Britain we're much more suspicious of ours. So do you think, does the panel think that is a challenge for the UK to try and sort of emulate Singapore's success?
Yeah, I think, it's a good point, and I think one does, where there are lessons that we can certainly learn from Singapore, and I sort of laid out some of them, and lay out some of them in the report. But we also equally, and this is true also of sort of at least historically Hong Kong, that these are city-states, and there's a limit to what you can learn from a city-state. Singapore, and to some extent, historically Hong Kong, are run sort of in some ways more like corporations than they are countries, and certainly that's very true of the Singaporean government's stakes in some of those major companies like Temasek and so on. But I don't think, so I don't think that is a reason to then say, well, we must also control our companies, and we must also that I don't think is the reason for the success. I think the reason for the success is, one, being very open on trade, having a very liberal trading system, and two, having a highly competitive market within the constraints of what you can do as a very, very small sort of city-state. What's true of competition in a city-state is very different from a major country with 60, 70 million people living in it. So I think there's a limit to how much you can draw that conclusion from Singapore.
Everyone always talks about sort of Brexit and Singapore on Thames as though Singapore is some sort of Ayn Randian utopia. And like, the most striking thing in the last few months is that Singapore is actually just incredibly well governed. They're very, very good at things like stopping pandemics breaking out, and tracking track and trace, and developing little tokens for.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost a pejorative term, isn't it? Singapore on Thames, and I think the Singaporeans don't even recognise themselves in it, and I think that's very much a straw man argument that Singapore is this cipher for deregulation, which, as Robert just mentioned, it isn't. But what they do in Singapore, I think, is smart government, is pro-competitive regulations that are recognise the legitimate regulatory purposes that exist, and have smart processes. So if you look at the border issues in Singapore, how they handle the border, how they developed systems with respect to a single window and some of the things that Frank mentioned, these are really good lessons that we absolutely could learn from. So I would say, you've got to understand what is portable in terms of what they've done, and I would submit these are the kinds of things that are portable, but not to sort of say, well, they have this type of approach to some of the largest companies in Singapore, and that's been successful. I mean, people made these arguments about Japan and Korea as well, because they intervened in their market, because they were somewhat more statist, that's why they were successful. And I would contend also with Japan and Korea is that actually they got a lot of things right, but that aspect of it and that intervention in the market is what they got wrong. And it held up their growth, and you had very limited growth in Japan for a long time, and you had the chaebol crisis in Korea, largely because of you built up these very uncompetitive companies. Robert made a point earlier on about the beauty of competition is it makes our own companies more efficient, it makes them better. And this didn't happen in Korea because they were protected. And as a result, when the crisis happened, these companies just blew apart, and it was extremely bad for the Korean economy.
I think from the perspective of an exporter of products that have to comply with whatever the regulatory regime is in the country of destination, I mean, really there are 2.5 hyper regulators worldwide in our sector. So the US, the EU, and China in the Asia Pacific region. So finding that sweet spot where you're complying with everyone's regulations is important, not just in terms of your exports to those countries, but also to countries who are inspired by their regulations. So the great battle in our sector, as it is with others, is do you follow the US approach or do you follow the EU approach? And I think there is a space there for the UK to find a middle way, if you like, that works for our industry, and finding ways to influence regulators both in the US and in the EU, to deliver benefits ultimately for UK exporters and third country markets.
Frank, did you have anything to add about Singapore?
Yes, I think that, and just to amplify some of Shanker's comments, it's essentially one big port, isn't it? So to put a single trade window around that, and with the amount of control and ability to influence decisions there that the government has, if you compare that sort of fragmentation that's here, it's not a like-for-like model. So all of our ports independently owned, many different owners, and therefore to drive common policies and common agendas around those ports and the border crossing points is a very different prospect for us. So it's an interesting challenge for the UK going forward, how we do that, how we harmonise.
Thanks. I've got a question here from Juan Anzola, who asks, being the poorest nation within the UK, what could Wales do to achieve post-Brexit prosperity trade-wise? Wales relies a lot on transfers from Whitehall and the EU, and it unfortunately lacks a dynamic private sector. So a bit of a devolution question there. Who'd like to start?
Well, I think one of the things that's important is, first of all, I wouldn't characterise the Welsh private sector as not especially dynamic. I think it depends on the sector. It depends on the product, and you have, I think, in Wales some very good products. And I think certainly one of the things you want to do in your making yourself a more competitive economy is take advantage of where you have strength. And certainly things like Welsh lamb, these sorts of things, even in the agricultural space, are marquee brand products. And so what you want to do is ensure that bans on these products, for example, when it comes to Welsh lamb and lamb in general from the UK into countries like the US, are lifted. This is one of the aspects of why the UK-US deal is important. So you understand what you need to do. And the question that I would ask all of the whether it's Wales or Scotland or any of the devolved nations and any of the sectors in those nations is, what is it that you would like to do, or what is it you would like to see in your markets of opportunity that you can't see right now that is preventing you from doing well. And I think there's no better example of an industry that's done this than, I'm not just saying it because he's on the panel, but the Scotch whisky industry has been a fantastic industry in terms of identifying what barriers do they need to break down in order to be successful, and how do you actually become successful, and then to literally go after them with a laser focus. That's what you have to do, and anybody can do that. That is not sort of, we now look at the Scotch whisky industry as a huge, hugely successful global industry, but it was not always. That was not always the case. They did some very specific things that led to the position they're in now, and there's no reason why that can't happen, all over the United Kingdom.
And just one very quick thing on this, because I know we've not got much time left. One of the sort of drawbacks we have in the UK is that, again, it comes back to the sort of picking winners thing. Like, our industrial strategy is built around the idea that everyone can be, like, if you go around the country, and the number of people of councils which are trying to become fintech hubs, life sciences hubs, creative arts hubs, like, you can't all be those. So but equally, that each region of the UK has enormous strengths, has enormous historical, traditional, infrastructural, things that it can and should leverage. But I think there's a question of just being really kind of smart and like working out what your USP is. What's the thing which we need to do as a nation as well. Work out what is the thing which gets us prosperity that we have. What is our advantage that we have that others don't, or what advantage can we sustainably build?
Well, I think this brings in a question that Anonymous has asked about agriculture and whether or not FTAs could potentially undermine agriculture, British farmers, given that we have high standards of welfare, whereas a free trade deal might open our market up to lower standards. I mean, Frank, you were talking about the blockchain technology, but is there a risk there that British farmers lose their competitiveness?
Yeah, there is a very real risk, and I think we all need to recognise that. And there's certainly a lot of the work we're doing is in Northern Ireland at the moment with some of the farming community there, and they're painfully aware of the threats that various free trade agreements and various other changes in trade legislation could affect them. So the important thing for them is a bit like Martin's association is it's all about brand. It's all about creating that brand and that identity and that value. This is grass-fed, pure Irish beef that is, quality guaranteed, and something that you can't replicate. It's about creating that brand, and every product has to have its brand and its position, but it has to be secured. And so the blockchain technologies that we've been trialing is exactly about doing that. It also has the wonderful offshoots about health and safety and animal welfare and reducing fraud, etc., in the marketplace. So there are tremendous benefits as well that it brings with the overall solution. But I'd say it's about protecting that brand, and you do need technology and support to do that in this day and age.
And I think the Trade and Agriculture Commission work is very important and interesting in this space, because when you go into a negotiation, you need to know what your bottom line is and what you can give and what you can't. So it's incredibly important that work continues and influences government policy. And I think on the geographical indication point, the main reason why the EU has pushed the GI concept in its FTAs very successfully is to help the agricultural community move up the value chain, and that's negotiating that is fantastic, but industry has to invest behind that. There's no point using up negotiating capital for something that you're not actually going to use. So I think that's a challenge for industry as well as for negotiators.
Rob, agriculture has been a bit of a sticking point in the Brexit negotiations. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, I think they're completely right. We in the longer term, we need to compete on quality. We're not going to win on volume. But also, I mean, there is also, I do have to say, a bit of a myth that Britain has utterly wonderful agricultural standards which no country in the world can match. The fact is, rather embarrassingly, we import chicken from Brazil and Thailand, which is cheaper than UK chicken. And when the RSPCA went to check, it found that their welfare standards were better than ours because they had more space for the chickens to live in. You know, so I think there is a slight element of myth making around the idea that you know, that a free trade deal with America, for example, will mean a flood of cheap meat. Beef prices in the US are higher. Beef prices are higher in the US than they are here. So if anything, you know, a free trade deal on agriculture is going to result in us kind of deluging America with lamb, not them, you know, sending cheap burgers over here.
Thanks. I've got one here from Jennifer Powers, and this might be a good one to sort of wrap up on. She says, both Rob and Shanker have made the point about the importance of domestic regulation to not only our competitiveness, but to the success of our global trade policy. So if each of the panelists had to name 3 specific domestic reforms that would be of the most use, what would they be? And should we start with Shanker?
Sure. I'm gonna be very trade focused or trade and focused in this. So I'm not going to talk about you know, all the many reforms that need to happen in the UK, but those that have a specific impact on trade. So I would start off with, you know, to Rob's last point about agriculture. It's incredibly important that we comply with the international rules of the WTO and that we comply with the SPS agreement. It would be a very, and I say that in the context of the EU not being compliant with SPS WTO rules in a number of sectors, including GMO and hormones and so on. And even the famous chlorinated chicken case, you know, would have been a case that the US would have brought, but didn't bring it because of the TTIP negotiations. So basing our agricultural regulation on sound science, not being discriminatory, not being restrictive is very important. Agriculture may not be a big sector in the UK, but it is the gate for all countries. It's the gate through which all trade policy tends to flow. And if you look at the countries that we've rightly chosen to be our sort of initial trading partners, they are all big agricultural exporters. They are all going to have a lot to say about this area, and they will not all, you know, view very dimly a UK that is a sort of mini version of the EU on agriculture and SBS issues. So that's one area. I think also the digital services tax that was mentioned before. I mean, this is the kind of area, and this is very often true of the regulatory reform agenda. You change it not because your trading partner is complaining about it. You change it because it's bad for you as a country. The fact that they're complaining about it is often because it has damaging trade and competition effects across the market. So I think that is not a good. This is not a law that is going to promote a dynamic innovation digital sector in the UK. Where are the next major companies going to come from in this area? Well, if you enact things like digital services taxes in the way that they have been enacted now, or the way that they're being proposed now, then you're unlikely to develop in that space. And then, since you asked for 3, I think another domestic policy choice would be, you know, really accelerating the free port agenda and using it. Don't just turn these things into special economic zones that have that have tax benefits and tax incentives, but you really use the opportunity to test new regulatory systems that might be more pro-competitive, but that might be quite difficult to do at a national level. So things like planning. How creative can you be in these zones in ways that you might not be able to be at a national level? So I think that there's a whole range of things, of reforms that you can plug into the sort of free ports, because if you can demonstrate success, that is what enables you to face down the vested interests or the beneficiaries of the status quo, who tend to be very politically powerful. So those are the 3 things I would focus on. And I'll just say one thing about the US agenda, because I know there's a question about this. I would also focus on a down payment in advance of that agreement, because it might be slightly delayed because of the change in administration. But a down payment that shows that there is a value to the US of the UK being outside of the European Union.
Martin, 3 domestic reforms.
Okay, well, probably quite selfish, I suppose, as some of them relate to our sector. So there's a UK excise tax reform review underway at the moment, and there's an opportunity to modernise the system. And I think if we can do that, then that would be tremendously helpful, certainly for us in overseas markets. I'd echo Shankar's point about compliance with WTO rules. When we decide how we want to support aerospace, we need to make sure that that does comply with WTO rules. And the final one, I have now forgotten what it was, I'm afraid. It'll come back to me too late. Yes.
We can come back to you if it pops back into your head. Frank, three things you change.
It's probably not my area of expertise in terms of domestic reforms, etc. But what we're certainly experiencing is within the exit process, the exit process, is a real strong willingness by the UK to simplify some of our trade protocols and policies. So, for example, the simplification of the tariff system that we're introducing, and these are really welcome changes that we need to start encouraging. As we move forward, we really need to start building on what we have today with the AEO scheme, which is a trusted trader scheme, authorized economic operator. We need to build on those so that we have something that is far better than what's in place today and far more effective. And by that, the trusted trader type schemes enable us to move goods in a far less administrative heavy method, and it'll encourage trade both in terms of imports and exports. So I think I'll use those two examples really. It's looking at that reform of the customs procedures and administration policies that we've started on. I think that should be really accelerated.
Rob, your three policy changes.
I mean, obviously, I'm keen on free ports. I mean, I think generally speaking, we need to move away from some of the EU's DAFTA principles on financial services regulation, for example. Also, just the general the adoption of the precautionary principle on data and innovation. I mean, you know, we are shutting ourselves off from quite a lot of markets and quite a lot of future growth if we don't if we stick to their kind of risk averse thing. I think we need to look at the flip side of investment into the UK as well as exports from the UK. I think the UK's attractiveness as an investment destination has been slipping in recent years, and there's quite a lot of reasons for that, and we should look very, very carefully at those. I also think, I mean, I like the idea of sandboxing, as mentioned, and I think just and also, but also looking at non-trade barriers, as it were, not non-tariff barriers, but things like access to talent. You know, can we get the best people into this country, and that companies need and want, and will help us grow, and will build the ties with other countries.
Lovely, thank you. And does anyone else have any final thing they want to say?
I'll just say one thing in closing. And I want to pick up something Martin said about the UK finding a middle way between sort of the US and the European approach, and I want to suggest what that middle way might look like, which is again comes back to the issue of sort of bipolar world and competitive markets. Nations that are closer to that end of the spectrum tend to interrelate through mutual recognition, adequacy, and equivalence. So basically saying, look, we won't ask you to replicate our rule book. But we will recognise the ultimate regulatory purpose, and we'll recognise, we'll recognise your attempt to achieve that regulatory goal. So Australia and New Zealand would be in that camp. Then there's a different approach, which is you must copy our regulatory rule book in order to have market access. And I think the UK is emerging from, dare I say it, the European approach, which is much more about regulatory coercion based on the size of the market, into that sort of recognition type approach. And I think that would be a good middle way for a middle power to take.
Any other final remarks? No? Okay. Well, just remains for me to say thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion. Thanks to all our panelists, Shankar Singham, Martin Bell, Frank Dunsmore and Robert Colville. Don't forget to follow CPS on Twitter at CPS Think Tank, or go to the website cps.org.uk. Follow CapX as well, and sign up to our newsletters and tune in to further events. Thank you very much. Good evening.